If you would, you could turn over in your Bibles to the book of James, chapter 5. James, chapter 5, verse 17. We've been talking for some time about the idea of being a disciple. Began this series of lessons by talking about the notion that when the Bible mentions the word Christian, when the Bible uses that term, most of the time it means something negative. And yet most of the people in this world today who claim to be followers of Christ will use that term. And I'm not saying we don't use that term. Simply saying that throughout the course of this lessons, the idea of being a disciple is the more significant. It is the broader term. And it hopefully brings to mind some of the essential things that we need to understand about what this whole notion of, quote, Christianity is about. We live in a world that is diverse, and because it is diverse, there is a diversity of opinion concerning even those things spiritual. And yet, God tells us that the notion of diversity in reality, when it comes to those matters that have been established by God, really have no bearing whatsoever. In other words, where God has simply spoken, where God has laid out his plan for man, there is no compromise. There is no diversity, so to speak. We are one body, many members, and there are many things about us as individuals that are different from other individuals. And there are different levels of faith as we grow. From the time that we are spiritual infants until the time that we are spiritually mature adults, there are differences. And yet those things, those ideas are not the ideas that we have thus focused on in this series of lessons, which at the heart and the core has been simply defining what it means to be a disciple. And we ask the question, well, why define it at all? And why is it so important? Well, why is it important to know where you're going when you get in your car and drive somewhere? I mean, why is it important for you when you enter into those woods to know where the trail is? I mean, why is it important for you, before you pick up that thing that says warning, might cause injury, to know exactly what it is that you are doing, whatever that thing might be? You see, if we can't properly define what it means to be a disciple of God, a disciple of Christ, then why pursue it at all? And if we do define it, once we find what it is, then we have to make a choice as to whether or not we are actually going to pursue it. And that is a struggle, is it not? Sure it is. Some of the greatest followers of God that have ever lived struggled with that question. We're going to look at one of them today. There's a guy by the name of Elijah. Now, most of us know Elijah. When you're young and you're first learning those stories of the Bible, there are probably about two things that you're taught about Elijah and that you remember for a long time. Number one, he was in this great battle, this great conflict with the prophets of Baal on top of a mount named Mount Carmel. And when you're young, you kind of wish you could go there with your big bowl of ice cream and kind of hang out. But I mean, that's the one thing. On the other hand, another thing that you probably remember about Elijah is that he was taken up into heaven in a whirlwind. In a whirlwind. Okay? He didn't die. He was one of those few characters of the Bible that we're told didn't go through death. He was taken by God. Taken by God. But you know, Elijah is this really, really important character. He's a really important character. I mean, not only does he engage in that battle, not only is he taken up to heaven with this whirlwind, but when you turn over to the New Testament, you know, the New Testament mentions Elijah more times than any other prophet mentioned in the Bible. Oh, Isaiah is one of the greatest messianic prophets there was. I mean, Isaiah wrote Isaiah 53. That chapter that we just so love because it talks about the birth and the ministry and the death and the burial and the resurrection of Christ. It is kind of this precursor of the whole of what Jesus was all about. Isaiah would talk about, the virgin birth, and, Isaiah was a great prophet. And then we have, Jeremiah. Jeremiah was kind of the weeping prophet because he was persecuted so heavily by his people, and yet he stuck to his guns. And the people wanted to kill him, and they threw him in a pit, and he was up in that pit, up to his, probably armpits in mud. He was a persecuted individual, and he gave his entire life, for God, even from the time when he was a very young person. Other prophets are mentioned in the New Testament. For instance, the only one that really is mentioned in direct, comparison to Christ is the prophet Jonah, right? You received no sign, Christ would say to his own people, except for the sign of the prophet Jonah. How he was in the belly of the whale, the belly of the beast, for those 3 days, and then he would rise again. Similarly, Christ would be in the ground for that time, and he would rise again. But when it comes to sheer numbers, and when it comes to key and pivotal moments of time in the ministry of Christ, it is Elijah that takes the forefront. By the time we get over to the book of James, in James chapter 5 and verse 17, James says this. James says, Elijah was a man just like us. And he prayed earnestly that it would not rain, and it did not rain on the land for 3.5 years. I want you to pay special attention to that first phrase. Elijah was a man just like us. We move back in the Bible to the ministry in the time of Christ. We begin reading about a guy by the name of John the Baptist. John the Baptist comes and he is paving the way for Jesus in his ministry. And many people, when John started preaching, would cry out about John's preaching, Elijah has come back. Elijah has come back. When Christ is dying on the cross. And he cries out in that Aramaic, language, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. The people say, look, he's calling out for Elijah to come. Before that time, Christ would take his innermost friends among his disciples to the top of the mount of what we call transfiguration. And those friends would see him in all of his glory, and yet they were joined by two people. Anybody remember who? Elijah was one of them. Why Elijah? Why is Elijah so important? Well, I think one of the reasons why Elijah is so important is the statement that James makes. Elijah was a man just like us. But then there's another statement, I think, that makes Elijah important. You have to go back in your Bibles just a little bit to Malachi, last book of the Old Testament, to the book of Malachi in chapter 4. And begin reading at verse 5. It says, Behold, I will send Elijah the prophet before the great and the awesome day of the Lord comes. And he will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers, lest I come and strike the land with a decree of utter destruction. Now Elijah has been long gone when these words are written. Elijah is gone and into the heavens through that whirlwind, and here we're told that he's going to send back the prophet Elijah. He's going to send him back, and he's going to do this very specific thing. And most specifically, and the thing that I want you to notice is that he is going to turn the hearts of the people to their God. Now, take those two statements, and I think you have a really good picture of the ministry of Elijah, but not just the ministry of Elijah, a description of faith that when we look at it through the eyes of Christianity is a description of what our faith should be as well. Elijah was a man just like us. And yet at the same time, he was such a man that he was able to turn the hearts of the people back to their God. Now, unless I'm just kind of way off my mark here, I get the impression, having lived in this world for at least a fair amount of time, that our world, just like Elijah's world, is a place that desperately needs to have its heart turned back to God. You see, that's why you turn over to the book of Luke. Luke in chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, these very verses from Malachi, I almost said Malachi, I don't know what that is. Okay. From Malachi are quoted at the beginning of this ministry, which would lead to the ministry of Christ. Luke says, and he will turn the children of Israel to the Lord their God, and he will go before him in the spirit and the power of Elijah. Why is Elijah such a powerful individual? Elijah's story is an amazing story. And I just find it a phenomenal thing that we can go back into the Old Testament and we can have this perfect picture of what it means for us to be followers of God. And that's what I want us to do. I want us to look at just three simple aspects of who Elijah was. Because you see, God does powerful things through Elijah. God begins the age of his son, sent to this world to die and find salvation for mankind by referring to the power of the prophet Elijah. The simple fact of the matter is this. Elijah was just like us. He was a human being. And Elijah did powerful things. And then we could kind of tack on that first phrase too, just like we can. Maybe you don't feel the power of God in your life. Or maybe you're the kind of person that says to themselves, well, it's kind of all me, isn't it? Whether it's good or whether it's bad, it's kind of all me. It's all about what I do. It's all about my works. It's all about, the things that I can or shouldn't or might not accomplish. Three things about Elijah's life. Number one, Elijah was a man that never compromised his faith. Never compromised his faith. It's one of the first things that we learn about Elijah. Now, the name Elijah is a combination of two Hebrew words, El and the word Jah. And essentially, his name means, really one of two things. Either God is my strength or God is with us. One of those things. Either way, we see that power working in the life of Elijah. And because that power was working in the life of Elijah, he had this strength of conviction. Now, Elijah believed with all of his heart that Jehovah was God. That's why God gave him this name. You ever notice that? Now, we've mentioned this before, but, names in the Bible are kind of different than the way we name people today. When God gives you a name, it's usually a fitting definition of who you are as a person. That's why sometimes we find people's names changing in the Bible. Because as they change, their name needs to change to reflect who they are. Well, today you can name your child whatever, and it really doesn't have anything to do with, who they are. I mean, we've got Madison, right? Are you from Madison? Not from the, whatever. Maybe she's mad. She's mad now, but anyhow. Names are different. Names are different. But the name indicated that Elijah was devoted to God. Even at a time of great difficulty. Look at the things that Elijah has to do. First time we meet Elijah. Well, I'll tell you what. Let's turn back in our Bibles. Turn back in your Bibles to 1 Kings chapter 17. 1 Kings chapter 17. Israel is in a sorry state. The sorry state actually began about the time of Solomon. You remember Solomon in his latter years was turned from following the Lord by his many foreign wives. And that was kind of the downhill slide here. After him comes, Jeroboam. And Jeroboam is just a horrendous king. Israel never has. never really has much luck with the kings in their land. The vast majority of them are just horrible. But then there comes from time to time kings that are just absolutely horrible. Above and beyond horrible. Every king that comes after Jeroboam, it is said of them, and he walked in the way of his father Jeroboam and did evil in the sight of God. Until you get to a guy by the name of Ahab. And the Bible tells us that Ahab did more evil in the sight of God than did all of the kings that came before him. In other words, Ahab was a pretty evil dude. He was a pretty bad guy. Well, that's when Elijah lived. Elijah lived during the reign of this king, Ahab, who was an idolater, who sought the prophets of Baal and accumulated the prophets of Baal. But you see, Elijah is a prophet of God. And this is a problem because God comes to him and says, Elijah, you need to go tell Ahab what's up. So chapter 17 of Kings begins, or 1 Kings begins, now Elijah the Tishbite of Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain except by my word. Bold statement. Bold proclamation. A couple of things I want to say about the passage, however. Notice that little word, now. Now. If you go back to the original language, maybe a better translation of it is, and then. And then. And what it really indicates to us is that, here's the story. It's about a horrible nation that once had God, and they turned their back on God, and now they're living in idolatry, and things are just sliding downhill, and the people are horrible and immoral, and all of these horrendous things are happening. And then Elijah. Kind of like God saying, when things look really bad, God's still writing the story. It's not done until he says so. So, and then Elijah. But then I want you to notice, too, the statement that he makes. This is the first time, really, we're meeting Elijah. And look at the bold statement that he makes in front of the king of Israel. It would be like you and I walking into the New York Stock Exchange and saying, I declare by the power of the God whose presence I stand in today that the market will decline to the point that puts everybody in poverty until I tell you it's going to change. Can you imagine doing that? Jose's like, oh yeah, I'm going to do that. No, we don't do that kind of thing. But what if God told you to do it? Elijah listened. Elijah was that committed that he would walk to the palace, he would go in, and he would make this bold proclamation against the king. Because he believed that Jehovah was God. He believed that God would do the things that he said he would. And he and Ahab butt heads a whole bunch. But perhaps the best incident to describe that is the incident that happens on top of Mount Carmel. In order to discuss that, you got to go over to chapter 18. Chapter 18, Ahab and Elijah come together after many days, it says. After many days, they're coming back together, and God says, go show yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain upon the earth. Now, this rain is going to come in a couple of different forms. I don't know if you've ever thought of this before. I always thought when I read this passage that he was talking about just the drought. Just the drought. But when you get to the top of Mount Carmel and you see the sacrifice and all of it there and the water that is poured on, and God literally from the heavens rains down this fire and consumes it, I don't know. Maybe he means more than one type of rain. But it's going to rain, God says. And you need to go and you need to talk to Ahab. And he does, and the contest happens. And I love I love the part where Ahab stands in front of the people. Stands in front of the people, and he asks them the question, why is it that you waver between two opinions? How is it that you could be caught up between the one true and living God and this idol over here that's carved out of a tree, that's never done anything for you? But you know what? Just for the sake of argument, I'm going to show you just how absurd this is. And so he stages this contest. You build your altar, you call upon your God, and let's see what happens. And of course they do, and they cry out, and they cut themselves, and Elijah actually begins to taunt them a little bit. Hey, where's your God? Maybe he's not listening. Maybe he's fallen asleep. At one point he even says, maybe your God is in the bathroom. And of course nothing happens. And then Elijah says, it's my turn. And the Bible doesn't say that Elijah builds an altar. You ever notice that? You go to the context and look at verse 30 in chapter 18. It says, and Elijah said to the people, come near to me. And they all came near him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord that had been thrown down. God was with them at one point. They rejected God to the point where they tore down his altar, cast it to the ground, and there it was, scattered all over the place. And he brings the people, and he makes them build the altar back up. He cuts up the calf, cuts up the wood, fills the whole thing in a trench around it with water, calls upon God, and God consumes it. Now, put yourself in Elijah's position. It's an amazing story. And it's an amazing story of faith. Because here's this guy, Elijah, when his nation has turned against God, who is saying, I will not be impure. My whole nation may turn and go to these other gods, but I will keep myself from contamination. I will keep my life from the tarnish and the stain of the world. You see, if you want to be a disciple, that's where you've got to be. And that's where your thinking has to be. It's not that you look at the world and you say, I just hate the world. Those people, blah, blah, blah. It's not about picking on the world. Just like God told Jonah, man, there's a people over here who need saved, and they don't even know their right hand from their left hand, and you need to go and you need to preach to them. So it's not about hating the world. It's about keeping yourself untarnished from the world. It's the same idea that we have when we do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. Evil companions corrupt good morals, that type of thing. If you want to be a disciple, then you have to seek purity. You have to seek to rid yourself sometimes from the stain that the world can leave upon us. Man, that's a message the world needs to hear, isn't it? That we actually stand for something. The way people kind of mealy-mouth around things about today, it's a wonder, and sometimes you're really hard-pressed to figure out what do people actually stand for. I remember a couple years ago I read this article in I think it was Time magazine. I don't know, it might have been a Wall Street Journal, but it was about this woman, and she called herself Reverend Terry. And it was this New Age religion. And in this New Age religion, she had certain beliefs that she promoted among her believers. Now, you tell me, man, if you're a carnal person who kind of wants to have that spiritual flair, this is your thing right here. She said she taught a new type of Christianity. Happiness is limitless, and people don't need to change at all for the better, but simply realize that they are already perfect the way they are. Well, that's kind of odd. But then go on, she says, sin is simply, and this quoting, sin is simply self-hatred, and hell is what some of us build for ourselves right here on earth. The article goes on to describe how their followers were an audience of suntan Mercedes BMW driving, young people who did not know what it meant to be guilty of anything and sought happiness as the highest expectation of God. Folks, God wants you to be happy, but He wants your happiness to be found only in Him. Not a hunk of steel that you drive around the streets. Not some paper stacked up at a bank somewhere. Not some pleasure that lasts but for a season. See, those are all stains of the world. Number 2, Elijah was a man who did not conform, as we've said, but was a man that was also willing to be transformed. See, God came to him and gave him some pretty difficult. And Elijah, just like us, we've already said he was just like us. He was a man. He had the choice to say, yes, God, let your will be done. Or he could have simply said, no. Let my will be done. He could have been like Jonah and he could have fled. He could have been like so many other people. But he chose transformation. See, if you go over to the book of Romans, that's what it talks about. Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your reasonable worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. As you study and you read the Bible, you read about people whose lives were impacted by God and changed radically many times. I mean, look at the life of Saul became Paul. Look at the lives of those humble, fishermen who would end up dying martyrs' deaths for this man that just simply said, drop your nets and follow me. Look at the lives of the tax collectors. When God said, it's not all about the money. When Christ came and said, it's not about laying up the treasure, but seeking the greatest treasure, it would radically change their lives. Look at the 3,000 converted on the day of Pentecost. Look at the transformation. See, there are conformists in the Bible as well. Now, you can go and you can look at your Ananias and Sapphira's. People who wanted to maybe look spiritual, but, didn't quite want to transform the whole way. You can look at guys like Diotrephes, and you can look at Demetrius and so many others. Now, Demetrius might have been one of the good guys. I have to go back and look. But you can also see those who did not conform. Guys like Joseph, guys like Daniel, guys like Peter, James, John, who in the face of the trial transformed. You see, Jesus would say things like, you cannot serve both God and mammon. You will end up loving one and hating the other. And that's where our society kind of is today. There are two altars in this world. Is the altar to God in our life just simply the broken down ruins of what it should be? Or do we have it built up and strong and ready? And each and every day we lay ourselves upon that altar as that living sacrifice, saying, God, transform us in this day. Do with us what you will, because it's your will that matters, not mine. The final point is that Elijah realized that when he was weak, God was strong. Chapter 18 is that chapter that really begins around chapter 19. Begins kind of in chapter 18. But in chapter 19, Elijah has to flee for his life. And he ends up running from place to place, and all along the way, God is taking care of him. In one instance, angels are descending from heaven, and they're actually giving him things to eat and providing his sustenance. And yet Elijah finds himself in a cave, seeking willingly to separate himself from God, it seems. You know, man, I've read the story many, many times, and I love the story. But I always kind of wondered, why a cave? Did he really think he can hide from God? I thought, what's our cave? I don't know, people flip off the lights and think nobody sees. People tell a lie and think nobody hears. I think the cave is representative of that idea that we can be separated from God, when in reality, that's just not true. And we can have that spiritual separation, that is, that disconnection in relationship, but God always reaches out. Just like when Elijah is in the cave, God calls him to the mouth of the cave. And at the end of the day, and that still small voice calls to him. Despite his doubts, despite his fears, despite his anxieties, despite the pity party that he throws himself, woe is me, I'm the only one that's standing for you, God. God basically comes and tells him, look, even if it is just you and me, we're still going to win. The armies of the world can't overcome us. There is no power in this world that can overcome you when God is standing with you. And God comes to him and he demonstrates that power for him. And then simply says, go. Go with that power into this world and impact it for my cause. So we want to be followers. We want to be disciples. But we have to first and foremost be people who are willing to stand against the stain of the world. We have to be, second of all, transformed. And then finally, we have to realize that, when we are weak, that's when God can act in strength. See, it's his power that works in us. One passage is worth noting here. Go over to 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter 1. I want us to notice verse 29. Actually, beginning with 28. It says, God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God. And that's God's message for us today. We dare not compromise. We dare not dilute it. We dare not think that it is by our strength that his will is done in this world. Rather, we simply need to remember that wonderful lesson that we're taught by that passage that just about everybody knows. For God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten Son, that whoever believes on him shall what? Shall have that eternal life, right? Shall be saved. All the things that we mention are there in that one little verse. Through the power of God and are willing to commit to it, to have that strength of conviction about it, and to be transformed by it, imparts that wonderful salvation to us. If you're here this morning, you need to embrace that message, having never done it. If you're here this morning, you need to give yourself to him, or simply give yourself to him more fully and in a more committed way. Then the invitation is for you, as together we stand and sing.